All right, so I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to hear our program Welcome Better. And I wanted to welcome you on behalf of the City of Newburyport and also volunteering on the storm surge. I'm a member of Storm Surge and also on the city's flood resiliency committee. And just a sentence about the Storm Surge. We're a volunteer organization here in Newburyport. And essentially what we're doing is we're motivating our communities to prepare for sea level rise and effects of climate-induced storm activity and also the long-term effects of climate change. I'll set this next slide.
Can I resign now? No. Thank you, Mike. I think that it's critical that we begin coming together as a community to really begin to address these really significant issues that are before us. I don't think there's any question about it that these scenarios are not far off in the distant future, and we have to do everything we can. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the city currently does in terms of our preparedness, and certainly we had great experience with the what we referred to lovingly as Snowmageddon of 2015 and loss of the air-vac sewer system out on Plum Island for 3.5 weeks and to evacuate residents and whiteouts and having to, times you couldn't even pass on Plum Island. So we've had, the March storm where we had the houses go into the Atlantic Ocean, so Mother's Day storm. So we've had experiences with some of these events, the power outages recently, but we still have more work to do. And I am very pleased with what I'm about to tell you in terms of some of the work that we've done to get to this point and where we're going from here. So prior to any significant weather event that we know is coming, and we've been doing this for the past 8 years that I have been in office, is that we bring our entire community together in terms of public safety, police, fire. We bring the hospital, the ambulance, Salvation Army, Council on Aging, the schools, all of those players together, and we, Department of Public Services, of course, highway, water, sewer. We all come together, the Coast Guard's there, the Harbor Master's there, and we sit down and we go over what we know about the weather, the impending storm that's hitting, all the information that we possibly have. We review our assets. We, establish communication with National Grid, and there they always open up a municipal hotline room. We have contact directly with MEMA because they open the bunker in Framingham. There's every day, sometimes several times a day, conference calls with key city leaders about what's going on. We look at the assets we have. We review our contracts if it's a snow event or whether or not it's just in the summertime. And we determine whether or not we are going to have to open a shelter. We bring in the Salvation Army for that. We've used the Round School in Newbury previously for that. And we run through everything we know about the storm that's coming, where the hit, the impact's going to be, go over our assets, check communication protocols, who's going to take the lead. We follow the incident control model, which of course our Chief and Emergency Management Director will be talking to you a little bit more about in terms of that piece. But it's an important meeting for us as we begin to coordinate all of our efforts on a local level, regional level, and then with state resources. And we saw how effective this was going back to 2015. I don't know how we would have survived the 10 feet of snow in the 6 weeks that we ended up with on Plum Island. It was devastating, particularly out there. But we were fortunate to have the support of MEMA and the state administration. Lieutenant Governor Polito probably talked to me 1 or twice a day during that entire incident, and they were able to mobilize resources from other northeastern states, and particularly the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, who came out and helped us tremendously in bringing additional equipment and resources to our area to get through that particular incident. And that's the protocol that typically happens during these kinds of events. And what we do after the event passes, as we are constantly in contact, posting things on the website, opening up emergency ops on Low Street. Chief will talk to you more about that also. But one thing that I can't emphasize enough to every single person in this room is that you have to sign up for Code Red. That has to be on your cell phone or on your landline. You have to be able to have that kind of information and access to what's going on during the storm. And if you haven't signed up for that yet, I strongly encourage every single person in this room, reach out to your neighbors to be sure that everyone has that kind of direct access to what's so you can get information about what's going on. Certainly there's lots of challenges, especially if we lose power, and we're concerned about elders, people who are using, equipment that requires electricity. Those lists are with the Council on Aging, and we certainly have ways to reach out. During this last term, we had people actually going out to check on people on their homes. We can prioritize with National Grid what areas are the highest priority in terms to be restored, and we used that process again during this last storm and power outage. Once a major event occurs, we come back and do a debrief after, and we bring the whole team together and we sit down and talk about how did we do, what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better, how was our communication, and where do we go from here. So I think have developed a pretty solid protocol in terms of being able to be prepared as things go forward and get information out to the community as quickly as possible. Things like deciding when to turn on the blue lights for if it happens to be a snow emergency. We also have spent a lot of time reaching out for additional grants, and there'll be a lot of information from the rest of the department heads who are here who will talk to you about some of those programs we've worked on. And that has evolved over the last couple years into many trainings, and I'm sure many of you were here, the Meister Group who brought us together, and we looked at a roadmap for sustainability, talking about some of the issues in terms of storm surge and sea level rise. We had community builders in. This is a federal program from multiple federal agencies that came in and identified vulnerabilities for us, and then put together I think a pretty weak list of goals and action steps, but it was okay. It was another group of people who came and worked with us on assessments as we went out in the community and looked at where our vulnerabilities were. I had the opportunity to participate in a conference a year ago, October, where the Union of Concerned Scientists brought all the coastal mayors, invited all the coastal mayors to a brainstorming and workshop over a 2.5 day session in Hampton Beach, where we heard from, for example, the Mayor Zimmer of Hoboken, who her city was breached on both sides during Sandy, and talked about the work that she's doing in terms of addressing the next level of storm surge. It was a wonderful opportunity to listen to what other coastal mayors are dealing with, and we're all dealing with the same issues. And I think the information that Mike showed you of what's happening up and down the coast, we're all dealing with the same kinds of issues. Other things that we have done is our multi-hazard grant, which is put together, multi-hazard plan that is put together with the communities that participate in the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, and John Eric White, our city engineer, who will also talk about some of the work he's been doing in that area. And so that through that process also, we have a plan that identifies certain vulnerabilities in our city. But I think one of the best programs that we have been involved in most recently is what we refer to as the Sandy Grant. It was a funded program that studied the Great Marsh and 6 Essex County communities. We were fortunate to be part of that, and a really, really detailed report on where our strong vulnerabilities are. I think you saw some of them posted with those flags, our water plant, our wastewater treatment plant, of course, Plum Island, and our next steps now that we have also a second grant, which is the MVP grant, Municipal Vulnerabilities Grant, and that will take the information we have in the Sandy Grant that identified all these vulnerabilities, and at that next step will begin to help us in terms of what are the action steps. How do we prioritize these vulnerabilities, and what can we do to try and protect these important assets to our community? So we're working at this, I think, from a lot of different levels, and I think it's important to share that with the community that, we work very hard, we work collaboratively when in the event that there is some type of storm event coming. Certainly, we have a long way to go before we're in a situation to be able to deal with a storm of this type of surge that potentially is coming in our future. But we are moving in that direction. I'm very grateful to Storm Surge for the experts you've brought in to educate our community, and we certainly have a lot more work to do, and I'm very pleased to have other members of staff in the city get up and share with you their role in some of the work that we're doing. And I believe we start with Julia? No, Molly and Julia. Okay. Okay, together. Molly Ettenborough, most of you know Molly's work as our Energy and Sustainability Coordinator, also oversees our recycling program and has been a real champion with Julia Gofferson, our Conservation Administrator. We have also established an ad hoc resiliency committee who is also working on a resiliency. The work that we've been doing in this area also. So thank you all for being here. And please be sure to sign up for Code Red. It's really important. Thank you.
Mouse button on the, you can click it on there. Okay. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Molly Ettenborough. I'm the Energy and Recycling Manager for the city, and Julia, over here. Oh, sorry, microphone, thank you. Julia and I are gonna go over a little bit about our resiliency work, as well as, besides resiliency, what we've done already to minimize the effects of climate change. The Resiliency Committee was formed in 2015 by the mayor. There was a greater need to focus on this. So the mission of the Resiliency Committee is to analyze, coordinate, and develop plans in conjunction with regional planning efforts to increase community resilience. I think many members of the committee are here tonight, but their names are up here, but our co-chairs are Mike Morris, who was speaking earlier, and David Chatfield, who are both here. But without these community members and committee members, we wouldn't be able to do all the things that we're wishing to accomplish. Julia's going to start by talking about the initial grant that we received, the EPA grant, and then we'll bring it back to our current grant. Thanks, Molly. I'm Julia Godfredson, Conservation Administrator for the City of Newburyport, and I'm going to have to look at you over my glasses just so I can read the screen here. Sorry about that. So as Molly said, back in 2015 when the mayor assembled the Newburyport Community Resiliency Committee, about that same time in September of 2015, we also embarked on a project with the EPA through their Partnership for Sustainable Communities grant program, and ours was considered the Technical Assistance Grant for Riverine and Coastal Flooding. It wasn't a monetary grant, it was a 2-day workshop that they provided for us. The participants were FEMA, NOAA, Department of Transportation, HUD, EPA, Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management, and DEP, as well as all of our local departments, and the general public was invited. And it was a 2-day workshop that provided an initial assessment of existing city and anecdotal data on river and coastal flooding problems in the city. The result of that was a report, as the mayor referred to, not a very in-depth report, but a report that showed us what our vulnerabilities were, what we had identified, and a summary of possible strategies to address these problems. A couple of the recommendations in the final report were reduce flood risk for future development, promote stormwater BMPs in the business park. BMPs is the acronym for Best Management Practices for Stormwater. Regional planning to address flooding, and to coordinate current and future flood and climate risk assessments. So pretty broad level recommendations from that report. Thanks, Molly. Okay, so concurrently with that, actually, with that EPA grant, we were beginning just then to get involved in the federal Hurricane Sandy grant program, which the mayor also referred to. And that is a much more in-depth project that we took on through our local partners and National Wildlife Federation, Ipswich River Watershed Association, and a whole lot of other federal, state, and local partners. The Federal Hurricane Sandy grant program was initiated in, I believe it was 2012, right after the hurricane. It provides funding to projects that assess, restore, enhance, or create wetlands, beaches, or other natural systems to help better protect communities and to mitigate the impacts of future storms and naturally occurring events. That was the purpose of a huge amount of money that the federal government put out through grants through the Department of Interior. We were very fortunate, again, as the mayor said, to be amongst a group of 6 communities here at the Great Marsh communities, being Salisbury, Newburyport, Newbury, Rowley, Ipswich, and Essex, all in the Great Marsh, which is the largest contiguous salt marsh system in New England. And so there were 5 components of this grant that we received as 6 communities. A number of more technological and sort of nature-based projects, but at the same time, the 5th piece was this Great Marsh Regional Coastal Adaptation Planning process. The final product you can see here, this is the draft manuscript for the Great Marsh Regional Coastal Adaptation Plan. We just received, I believe yesterday, the final draft of that. The mayor has a copy, and the copies can be found. I think we have a link to them.
Yes, we do. We can put them on the website.
We can put it on the website. Right, great. So I'm going to go in a little bit more detail on how this came about, or how we worked to reach this plan. It's a 230-page report, so it's not a small thing. Part of the methodology was, well, the methodology for this was first to establish a formal stakeholder engagement process. So each community had its own stakeholder group. Ours involved people like Mike Morris, Joe Chichera, who's the chair of the Conservation Commission, myself, John Eric White, our city engineer, and other city staff and local experts. We got together monthly and spoke monthly, identified and prioritized our potentially vulnerable community assets. That was part of the vulnerability assessment process. We assessed both asset and overall community vulnerability to present and future climate impacts. At that step, we were doing a whole lot of modeling, USGS modeling, NOAA, and Woods Hole Group helped us with some very detailed and technical modeling projects. We identified co-benefit ecosystem-oriented adaptation strategies. That's sort of a fancy way of saying strategies to protect our natural resources along the coastline that would reduce risk and increase resiliency. We evaluated and prioritized those adaptation strategies, and then the result is that adaptation plan that we just saw a picture of. A little bit more now about the vulnerability assessment, which was probably the most detailed and probably the most important piece of that project. We first looked at community exposure. You can see this is Newburyport and our exposure to a 1% chance of flooding in the year 2070. Community sensitivity, identify the specific areas in Newburyport that were most vulnerable to coastal flooding and storm damage. We also looked at critical infrastructure, such as how many public utility stations are in these vulnerable areas, how many hazardous waste sites, etc. We looked at barriers to flow and areas of special concern. You might recognize this as a colorful depiction of our central waterfront. This was one of the areas of special concern in Newburyport. I think we would all agree with that. And this just shows a 1% chance of inundation, or actually the inundation depth during a 1% storm or the 100-year storm. And this is 2070. You can see that we're fortunate. We have some topography, and the higher areas of our downtown would be dry in this scenario, but we also have areas that would be under 4 feet or more of water at that time. So then the coast analysis was another really interesting model that was run for Newburyport. COAST stands for Coastal Adaptation to Sea Level Rise Tool, and we worked with GEI consultants to run this analysis on the downtown area as well as parts of the industrial park to look at potential damages to buildings from 3 sea level rise scenarios, both as single snapshots in time from a 100-year flood in 2030 and 2070, and as cumulative damages from all possible storms from 2015 to 2030 and from 2031 to 2070. It's a very interesting modeling process that gives you a result that shows the cost estimate, the monetary costs of real estate damages to buildings and structures in those flooded areas as a sort of a bar graph map where cost is relative to the height of each building. So you can see there's there's a building here that's much higher than the others. That would be the city's wastewater treatment facility. So that was obviously identified as one of our most vulnerable city assets. This is then just a snapshot of a part of the adaptation plan that goes through each of our priority assets and shows identified short-term and long-term strategies for addressing those vulnerabilities. 2 here are Plum Island Turnpike and the wastewater treatment facility, and there are several more identified in the actual plan. So that's it for my piece, and I'm going to hand it off now again to Molly to talk about the next project that we're working on now.
Okay, so exciting news for us. We have received another grant, and this one is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant. And this is going to help us take the plan that you just learned about and put it into action steps. So our Community Resiliency Committee will be helping with that. And this grant also allows us to have a technical assistance. And that person is going to be Ellie Baker, who is in the office. In the audience, thank you. She actually worked with us many years ago when Newburyport was trying to become a green community and helped us successfully do that. So we are very excited about that. And once we start working on that plan, we'll actually have action items that we can start initiating for all of our critical assets. The preparedness grant program was started by Governor Baker in 2016. It will provide us processing for planning and resiliency. We'll be holding meetings. There'll be a lot of community input needed. We'll certainly be relying on storm surge to help us get the word out, to get people involved, to get people to come to meetings and lend their support and ideas. We'll be doing a lot of the things that this adaptation plan that Julia just spoke of have already been done, so we're actually very fortunate that we had this Sandy grant. So we're kind of ahead of the game, so we're hoping we can move pretty quickly with this. And once we become an MVP community, we will be eligible for grants. So much like our Green Communities designation, we will be able to have grants that will actually help us take charge of some of these action items that we want to initiate. So the big question is, the next question, I guess I should say, is what are we doing, though, to lower our carbon consumption? And when we're talking about resiliency here, but what is the city actually doing to lower our carbon consumption in the first place so that we can mitigate some of these hazards? And the city has done a lot in this front, but it also needs to still accomplish a lot. So in 2006, the city established an Energy Advisory Committee. It was a small committee of 3, and Mayor Holliday expanded that committee. We now have 11 members. Some of our members are here today, and our chair, Mike Strauss, is here. That committee is extremely valuable to the city and has provided a lot of support, ideas, and expertise to the city. They helped us become a green community in 2010. That program is a state designation, and we have to follow 5 strict criteria. We have to report annually on the progress that we're making. We have to meet energy deadlines. We have to benchmark our buildings. We have to put everything into software and monitor what's going on a yearly basis. But it has provided us almost $1 million in grants over this term. So we've done a lot with it, and we have a lot more that we can still do with that. Newburyport has about 37% of its municipal energy usage covered by renewable energy in the solar farm in Salisbury, so that was exciting for us when we did that a number of years ago. So that means that we still have a ways to go in covering the rest of our municipal energy. We have some lofty goals of being net zero energy by 2050, and that means trying to cover all of our energy usage, both municipal and the entire city, with renewables. So we're working on that as well. As you probably have seen, we have upgraded all of our streetlights to LED. We purchased our streetlights. We were actually the first community in the National Grid territory to purchase our streetlights. That's going to be and has been already a significant savings for the city. We have run a number of energy efficiency campaigns for residents, and we've done a lot in our city buildings, but we've also run some solarized campaigns, and we have our Solarize Plus coach here tonight, Joanne Clemens. She's in the back. If you're interested in solar or air source heat pumps, please see Joanne. That's a great program where it's kind of like bulk buying for solar, so it's a really great time to do that. But in addition to that, the city has been fortunate again to receive grants, this time from Mass Clean Energy Center. We developed a clean energy roadmap, and that we devised 14 strategies to reduce our energy usage, and it was everything from energy efficiency to renewables and transportation items. So we are taking a close look at that, and we've actually accomplished a number of those items already. But that actually gave us a good start with the master plan. The master plan, I believe, came out of the planning board last night. Did it? Does anyone know? Yes. So now it will be going to city council for adoption, hopefully. And in that, we have, for the first time, an energy and sustainability chapter, and I believe that it is also woven throughout the master plan. So in that, there are a number of items that we will be undertaking. The energy goal that I talked about earlier, achieving net zero energy by 2050, working towards zero waste for our waste, water, protecting and conserving water quality and supply, food production by increasing and supporting local food production, and achieving and maintaining good air quality, also protecting habitat. And then lastly, again, we've come back to climate resiliency and all of the things that we need to do for that. So I will bring John Eric White, our city engineer, up here to talk about public infrastructure and the plans that he has for that. You're welcome. There you go.
Good evening, everyone. As she said, I'm John Eric, I'm city engineer. I've been here about 7 years, and I'm learning a lot about a coastal community. It's a great community, and my job is probably the best job out of everyone in this room, because I deal with just about everything. I deal with the coast, I deal with the inland, I deal with roadways, developments. It's beautiful. So out of all these grants that everyone's talking about, I'm going to try to get a little bit more technical, because there's so many studies, and we're all getting like inundated with all these studies. So it gets a little mind-boggling. Even for us, it gets mind-boggling. So now we're doing one more, the MVP. It's a great thing. We have to do it. But this past May, I wanted to get a step ahead of everyone, so I slipped in a few capital improvement program items, and my boss approved it, the mayor approved it, city council approved it. So I'm going to show you those in about a second. But I just want to assure you that we are doing action. It's not all just studies. The list of assets that we have just keeps running and running and running, get longer and longer. But the resiliency, the Great Marsh project that we just finished, came up with the most critical. The Sandy grant only had so much money. They couldn't do every community's list of assets. They just couldn't do it. So we created, we prioritized them. Most are public because we're the municipality. Some are private, but they're for the public good. So the mayor and Mike brought up the National Grid substation. That's huge. So the mayor and the city's, forcing them to take action. They're also taking action on their own, but believe me, part of me feels like they probably would not have taken as much action had it not been for us to push them. The jetties are another thing. We all know that the community forced the feds to work on the jetties. So the jetties are important, and the jetties are important for climate change because the storms are getting stronger and the sea levels are rising, and unfortunately, they're going to have to do another model. I don't want to get into that. But those are the type of things that are kind of a quasi-private public, as far as our community. There's a couple things that this event tonight is mostly for preparedness for emergency. And that's clearly, we all get it. So the slides that I'm going to show you, I'll touch upon preparedness from, what we're doing now and what we've been doing for years, but also preparedness for climate change impacts. So for the treatment plant, this is our most vulnerable asset, and we need to, we're looking at short-term improvements and long-term. And for years, Joe Dugan did a great job. Now Chris Pratt's doing an excellent job getting the plant prepared for basic emergencies, ice storms, snow, power outages. So the month ago, the power outage that we had, they experienced a shutdown here, but also at the water treatment. I'll touch upon that in a minute. And our guys, we have the generators. We improved this facility at $30 million or whatever it was. 4 or 5 years ago we finished. So there's a lot of emergency preparedness that's already in this. My job for this is I'm going to sit down with Chris Pratt over the next year and try to save some money of hiring out a consultant. And if we can list like 80% of improvements that need to be made to the plant to address sea level rise, storm surge, at least we can start that process. Right now, the renovation of the plant, the engineers did the right thing. They raised it higher than the FEMA, which is good. Unfortunately, it's still about 4 feet too low. So we'll have to work on that over the next couple of years. And long-term, eventually it'll probably have to get relocated. And one thing I'm trying to figure out is to put in the plan, where to make that happen. We could pump it up and over High Street, back down into the industrial park, provide treatment, pump it back to go to the same outfall that's in the river. And that might be the relatively cheaper of, instead of having an outlet in the Little River. So we'll maintain the outlet in the Merrimack, but there's a lot more pumps to be had. So those are the things that we're looking at for the treatment plant. The other critical asset is obviously our water supply. And the dam that we have, it separates the Merrimack River from the lower artichoke. It's a concrete dam, and like Mike said, it almost got breached in Mother's Day storm. So one thing I was able to slip in was $80,000 budget to do a feasibility study to raise that dam, and it's much needed. We need to keep the contamination from the river out of our water supply. So we're going to initiate that study. It's in the budget for this fiscal year 18. So we'd like to get that done by next summer. What I envision is the outcome of the design would be raising the dam and also provide controls, because we don't want to, increase the shoreline and start taking up people's property with a raised dam. So pending a storm, maybe we'll have a temporary inundation of local properties, but that's too much detail. But what we hope to get is a higher dam, and that's in the books right now. It's in the planning stage, and this is what one of our CIP program items look like, and it has, you know, the urgency, the cost factor, and then what year you want to put it, you know, which fiscal year you want to put it in. So this got approved, City Council approved it, so we'll be jumping on that. The other item, which is related to this, is protection of our water supply. So right now, the city in the past, Paul Kobe was our plan operator. They went after grant money to protect the watershed. We're continuing to do that. We need to increase that level of effort because there's more for sale signs around the reservoirs from our neighboring communities. So we need to pump up that volume again. But it's all part of, if we keep that undeveloped and the water remains clean, the heavier storms, less pollution, if it becomes all developed and we get these huge inundations from these storms, it's gonna be a detriment to our water supply. So we need your support on that, because that'll be a costly item. Another critical asset is Water Street. And in this slide, the section, you know, that I'm primarily dealing with is from the treatment plant to Ralph's, you know, Ocean Ave at the end of Ralph's Lane. Ralph's is Newbury, Ocean is Newburyport. In this section, there's also a pump station. So we have a handful of small lift stations for sewage. Those have to get addressed fairly soon, I'd say within the next 5 or 6 years. Those are simple fixes. We can just raise the cover. Hydraulically, there's ways to do it, fairly inexpensive. But Water Street, we would like to get our community prepared that as the oceans rise and the Merrimack River rises, someday we're going to have to raise certain roads. So we don't have a perfect answer right now, but common sense says the ones that are on the land side of the road, someday we may have to put those up on stilts. There's down in New Jersey, contractors have really lowered the price for doing that type of thing. Those are types of things that we're going to get into this resiliency plan as a community to give you ideas so you can prepare. It's not to scare you, it's to be prepared. That type of thing, you know, we're looking way down the road, but it's still going to be part of our plan. Cashman Park. The reason why Cashman Park is on our list, the older we all get, we all realize that, you know, sports fields, playing sports, the arts, all these cultural, you know, public parks, all that is just important for our society, for what's inside our brain, for mental health. So keeping Cashman there is really important. It gives a place to go. We all have some ideas. It's not rocket science. We just need to spend 10 years to bring in some fill and raise it up. It's not very difficult. You know, this is probably the easiest thing, but it's very important. And I think we should, as a community, I think we should do it. One slide that didn't make it is the waterfront. And the waterfront is another, you saw the slide before. The waterfront is another item where I think between the Black Cow and the Harbor Master, I personally think that's a very doable improvement that we can make to prepare ourselves for sea level rise. Right now, we just redid the bulkhead. That has like a 25-year life. When that expires, just plan on raising it higher and then fill in the infill. One of the owners, the owner of the Black Cow, they're relocating to Water Street, or, that section of Merrimack. Fantastic idea. He's up to 14 now. He'll be out of harm's way. He's going to leave it there. He's going to build it there, and he also filled in his basement to lower his insurance rates. They were going to charge him, tens of thousands a year, so he filled it in. Those are the things we're going to try to get in our plan as ideas to help everybody out, because we're also we have to deal with flood insurance rates, those type of things. We also have to my last comment, it brings everything together. We also, in our rezoning, there's no case law yet for providing a zoning ordinance that deals with a projection down the road of sea level rise. And we're all waiting for that community or the feds to come up with something that we can use as a guide. So without that, we need to do incentives. So for all you developers out there, we need to work as a community, because if you leave your development low and it's a retail and our public citizens have to get in there, if it's too low and it's just all parking area and driveways and walkways, it's not going to be very long from now when those start to flood, and they need to bring them up. And if the higher they go, the better off we'll all be, because it's going to come sooner than we think. So there's only so much we can do with private. Public, we can do a lot more. I assure you that we're doing a lot more. The mayor, Tony Fenari's group, everyone's trying to do a lot more, and that's for infrastructure. So now for the real emergency preparedness, I'd like to turn it over to Chief Leclerc.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. I'm Christopher Leclerc. I'm the Fire Chief and the Emergency Management Director, and I wanted to talk to you about the city's emergency management program and plan and those that are involved in it, and hopefully have time for questions afterwards. But I am Emergency Management Director appointed by the Mayor. Chris Richard, one of the firefighters in the city, is the Deputy Director. He handles all of the computers and the equipment inside the building, and is on standby in the event that I'm not around. But the good news about emergency management in Newburyport is that it's truly a team effort. And you'll see later in the pictures that we're used to operating as a team effort. We're used to operating in our emergency operations center. We have a tremendous amount of city staff, and by tremendous I mean the quality, not necessarily quantity. Between our police chief, our city marshal, our DPS director, health services, you've met some of them tonight. But the way all the departments work together to get ready to plan, the mayor touched on it, when there's a storm on the horizon, we're talking about it. We're talking about it amongst ourselves. We're talking about it with MEMA. We're getting regular updates. I'm one of those people that still likes to watch the news and watch the weather. I grew up in a house that you could make all the noise you wanted to, but if you made one peep when the weather was on, you were going to get it. So we got used to watching the weather and kind of planning our life around what the weather's going to do. So as the mayor will tell you, we're always talking about the forecast. One of the fun things about living in New England is watching the forecast. It was 70 last week, and now I don't know what happened. And we complain when it's too hot, we complain when it's too cold, and we're thankful for the good days. But we have to be ready. The neat thing about living in New England is that we don't know what's going to come next. It could be a storm. It could be we had that winter with 10 feet of snow. We had a windstorm a couple weeks ago that really threw the whole area into a tizzy for 3 or 4 days that nobody expected to have happen. We didn't expect it. National Grid didn't expect it. We have a wide variety of things. It's our job to work with MEMA and work with our city staff to make sure that we're ready to go. Now we have you told me how to work this. There we go. On Low Street, we have the Emergency Management Building. It's an old armory that was converted into actually a pretty nice office space. This picture here, we're unfortunate enough to have a nuclear power plant in our backyard. The fortunate part of that is we are one of the communities in the 10-mile emergency planning zone that has to practice the plan. So if you get outside that 10-mile emergency zone, I bet there's towns that have emergency operations plans on the shelf. The chances that they drilled on those and are familiar with them are probably pretty slim. In the 10-mile emergency planning zone, we have to practice on it. We have to educate our staff what to do in the event of an emergency at Seabrook Station. And every other year, we have drills and graded exercises where the federal government comes in and grades us on our ability to respond to an emergency at Seabrook Station. Now getting into the pluses or minuses of the plant, but just to say that our staff is used to working as a team, used to working in our emergency operations center, we're used to looking at the plans and figuring out what to do in our area. This is the recent drill, and we have another drill coming up and a graded exercise. This is the year for us. The different stations inside the Emergency Operations Center on Low Street where we will monitor those situations that befall the city. Now, not every storm means we're going to open the EOC. The EOC is not where we command the storm from. The troops on the ground and the people out in the street and those dealing with the emergency will still be in command. The EOC ends up as a clearinghouse. So for needed equipment, extra help, if there's a large storm and we open the EOC and we advertise that emergency management number on the web, when you have questions about what's going on, we tried to corral the questions about the restoration of power after the last storm, to have it all come through emergency management for a couple of reasons. One, we're the people that are in contact with National Grid. We're the ones that are in contact with them on the phone, but we're also in contact with them in their supervisor trucks on the street. It's our fire department staff, our officers talking to those people. We get an idea of what their plan is. We work with them so they know what our critical needs are and what areas we want them to go to first. A typical example of that is in one of the neighborhoods, the tree came down, took a bunch of wires down, and even though they were not live, we want everybody to treat them like they're live, so there was a lot of people that had to stay away from that area, and it was a while before we get National Grid into the neighborhood to at least pick the wires up. I didn't want power restored, I just wanted the wires picked up. So sometimes you actually have to grab the supervisor and take them where you want to go. And we were finally successful in getting that out, but because of the areas like that, the decision was made to postpone trick-or-treat. We had a lot of angry kids on our hands, but we'd rather have angry kids than have one kid get hurt until we had a chance to work with National Grid to get all this cleaned up. So those are the decisions that are made on a city level. But if the calls and the requests are all coming into one location, we lets us know what areas of the trouble the city we're having trouble with, where the hot spots are, what critical infrastructure is still without power. And as you folks know, obviously the hospitals, the nursing homes, that stuff is going back on first as fast as we can. And then we work out with critical infrastructure and try to work out depending on how quickly we restore it. In this last storm, the damage was actually in a substation. So even though people were saying, I didn't see any National Grid trucks out there, well, there was really nothing to do in your neighborhood because we had no power to send your way. So once we got that word out to people, people were a little bit happier. But that was a windstorm in October that knocked the trees and power lines down for 3 or 4 days. We weren't ready for it. And as much as we talk about planning and emergency planning, not only on behalf of the city, but individually, think about it and think about whether or not you were ready for that storm. And we weren't, and winter's coming. So we'll get into a little bit about personal preparations as well. Just some more shots from inside the building. Not only we have equipment, emergency management is tied closely with our public safety team, fire and police. Most of the help that we're going to get either in our EOC or out on the street is going to be the same emergency officials that you see day in and day out, responding to fires or responding to police calls in the city. Working closely with DPS for any street closures, any trees that we can clear that aren't tied up in the power lines. So that's all the same team. It's the same people. We're going to ask from the EOC if we need state resources. The mayor talked about like the plows coming in from Pennsylvania. If we need state resources, or if it's even bigger, we need federal resources. All of that will be coordinated from our Emergency Operations Center. So in the future, if there's storms, and we haven't opened the EOC yet, your inquiry should go to the fire department. Now, once those calls get overloaded, we're going to open that EOC line, so you can actually call somebody, talk to somebody. We'll keep a list of everybody that's communicating and where the hot spots are. We don't open it for every storm. This is New England. I'm always amazed when they predict snow in every news station, it's the top story. Oh my God, it's going to snow. Really? New Hampshire? Seriously? Or Massachusetts, it's going to snow? That's amazing. It's a major news event. And then eventually they go to the forecast to show us how much snow. We know we're going to have storms here. We know we're going to have windstorms. We know that each and every one of us has got to be prepared. We talk about all the time, and we talk about it ad nauseum, about what you want to do for a home preparation kit. We're not going to stop Mother Nature. The best thing that we can do is be prepared for it when it hits. So if it's a small storm and you're going to stay home and we close the schools and the kids are home, what do you have to have? You got to have the water. We talk about water for people. We think about how much water you're supposed to have a day and how much you want for people. Non-perishable food items. Remember the old days of board games? How many of you have board games anymore? Stock the house up so the kids have something to do. It is amazing the chaos created by the power going out for 10 minutes, the internet goes down, the games don't work. That's unbelievable. Imagine doing this for hours or days. So find something to keep them busy. But you have to be self-sufficient. We know it's New England, we have to be self-sufficient for 2 or 3 or 4 days. You know, the power went out in some areas of town for 3 full days, and people were very, very angry about that. They were angry it happened. They were angry that National Grid wasn't in their neighborhood the minute after it happened, which just wasn't possible with the wide span of damage that that storm took throughout the entire valley. Watching the crews come in and watching them work was actually something to see because they didn't take any breaks. They worked until they were done. And we were out there with them. So how many of you have basements that flood? And how many of you have basements that flood every time it rains and every time there's a huge storm and still haven't bought a pump? This happens all over our city. So we get a major rain event, basements flood, call the fire department to come pump out the basements. We don't mind doing it. We don't mind in emergency situations coming out and helping everybody out. But after we go to the same house, storm after storm after storm, you know you have an issue, get a pump. Some people are fortunate enough to put in generators. It's an expensive proposition, but we live in New England. It's something we should think about, especially if you live in a neighborhood that every time there's a storm, and I hear this from people, every time there's a storm, my power goes out. I said, well, did you think about buying a generator? Well, no, it's too expensive. I get the cost, but if you're in one of those areas, think about that. People that have people in their homes with special needs, oxygen pumps, these type of things, have had to go to the generator route. And that will help you sustain your household for an extended period of time while the power comes back on. We'll come out and help any way we can, but we have to ask everybody who lives in New England to get prepared for storms. They're coming. Now, we can plan for hurricanes. We can talk about storm surge. What do we do when we have hurricanes come up the coast? And not just our everyday storms. We watch the weather. As the mayor said, we talk about it. We get daily conference calls and daily updates from MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. Phone calls, conference calls ad nauseum, talking about the storm that's coming. Depending on the storm, and you know, we talk about worst case scenario, we talk about storm surge, that would be very unfortunate. The fortunate part for us is we live on coastal Massachusetts. I'm more worried about those winter storms, the unnamed storms, than I am of a hurricane coming up the coast and somehow finding a way to back in on us. And what happens in a hurricane? Is the storm surge really what we're going to worry about? Yes, it's a possibility. If they're predicting storm surge of that type that's going to take the island, that's going to inundate some of our coastal areas, then we'll work with the mayor, we'll work with the governor, and we'll work on plans to evacuate those areas. Our job in emergency management is to get you out of harm's way. Not to stop the ocean, not to keep the house from being knocked over, but to make sure that we don't have losses of life or severe injuries in storms. So in those situations, when the order to evacuate is given, People need to heed that order to evacuate. If you were here for the Superstorm Sandy presentation, they ran into the same problems that I know, and I've been doing this a long time. What's going to happen? We're going to tell you to evacuate, to leave your homes. And we're going to hear, I've been living here 40 years, I've survived every storm, I'm not leaving. This house has been here forever, young man, I'm not leaving. Ma'am, if you don't leave and the water gets too high, we will not be able to come get you. I don't care, I'm fine. We leave, the storm comes, the phone rings, come get me, I can't get out of my house. So now we're endangering personnel to go into those areas to get people out. It's the same thing that happened during Superstorm Sandy. When the order is given to evacuate, and if you hear an order to evacuate the island or evacuate our lower areas from, recommended by myself and coming from the mayor, it's serious. Because if they've convinced me that we need to evacuate, it's a serious storm coming. If you hear that from us, please do it. If you don't, it's be very difficult to get you out. Okay? The good news is that's the worst case scenario. The way the Cape goes out and hooks around, and the topography that we enjoy in the location, the country, and the cold water is going to make a major hurricane coming on us very, very rare. Has it happened before? Yeah. The storm surge is not the part I'm really worried about. What happens in a hurricane? What do we need to worry about? Same thing we worried about 2 weeks ago. It's the wind. The wind, the trees, the power lines, all of that coming down. The lack of heat, depending on what year it is, time of year it is. Sometimes we need power to pump the water, to pump the sewage, that type of stuff. That's what we really need to worry about, is the wind damage and the danger to lives that way. So the plans are there to, what do we do, or how do we plan for an event? How do we get people out of harm's way? How will we evacuate the city? Fortunately, we live on the East Coast, which means we're only going in a couple directions. It's not that difficult to get people out of town. We're also fortunate with our demographics that we don't have a lot of people that will require shelters. Most people in our community have relatives in the area or relatives somewhere else and will find their own where to go and would rather stay in a relative's home than in a gym on a cot. But we do have plans in place for those people that do have to be somewhere. We'll be working closely with our nursing homes, our hospitals, to make sure that they have plans, that they're ready to shelter in place for some time before we may have to move them, depending on what low-lying area they're in. But it is there. I'm looking forward to the question and answer period later for any questions that you have. But we just want you to know that there's an emergency management staff that works closely with our city, the entire city staff. The plans are in place. They're practiced. We're used to working together. We have not only stationary equipment, but mobile equipment, working with our fire, our police, and our DPS to respond to, mitigate, and start the recovery from any storm that might befall our area. So thank you for your time. And I don't know who I'm turning over to next. Back to you.
All right, so we're going to start the question and answer part of our program to give you an opportunity to ask some questions of people here in the city. And I think we're going to probably bring the lights up, and we'd like you to step up to the microphone there so we can capture your questions. And we're going to have the panel sit up here on this table so they can face you, and the appropriate people can respond. Just waiting for the stagehand to turn the lights up. Okay. So I recognize this fellow, Ron Barrett, from Plum Island.
Hello. Is this on? No. Oh, you probably can hear me anyways. My name is Ron Barrett. I'm the president of the Taxpayers Association on Plum Island. And what I'd like help to do is, we have a building that we've all used, and I want us to get together, and I want Pitter to be part of this emergency thing, so it isn't an emergency thing when it happens, and all of a sudden, can we use that hall, can we not use the hall, who's in charge of the hall, who's there. I want a setup of how we use the hall in an emergency. Because it belongs to all the people of Plum Island, not just Newbury where the building happens to be. As you know, in 15, when we had a bad storm, we used it the whole storm. We kept it open for the whole time. We've now put a generator in that runs the whole building if everything comes down. So I would like some type of emergency program that I don't have to talk to this chief, that chief, that it just gets taken care of and it works for everyone on the island. Is that possible?
Of course. I think that's a great idea, Ron. I mean, I think we, at the time of when we opened it for the 3.5, 4 weeks that we needed to when, during 2015, during that period, it was a little challenging initially because that was one of the places that had a working bathroom, and that was important, having lost the sewer system on a good portion of Northern Boulevard out to the point in Newburyport. I think that part of our resiliency plan and emergency preparedness is it's easy to be able to, because we collaborate all the time when there's issues on Plum Island. So in order to set a protocol for the use of Pitta Hall, I think could easily be part of the plans that we're working on going forward.
Because what happened is the people who were coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning to use the toilets, like women and whatnot, they were a little nervous because they were going into a building late at night. We left it lit the whole time. And they asked me if I could get some type of police or anything. I went to the Newbury police and they just kind of ignored me. All I asked for was the cruiser to come by, maybe sit there instead of sit at the center or something like that. And nothing. And we need things like that when we have an emergency like that. And we need everybody to be able to use that hall. Last year, when the wires went down, I went to the hall. The Newbury police were asleep in the hall. The ambulance was sitting over on the side, and the Newburyport fire truck was down the center, and the whole building should be lit up and open, and everybody should be able to be there and be able to respond from there, I would think.
Well, I think the mayor is right about the resiliency plan, and also we have a member from Newbury, John O'Connell, who sits on our resiliency committee, and our MVP technical assistant, Ellie Baker, is doing the MVP preparedness plan for Newbury and Newburyport, so I think we can add that to that. Doesn't that make sense?
But it's pretty important in that it's December that we get something together.
Soon.
Yeah, because January, February, we can start getting weather, March, And we have it's not like we can't be a group together. We started in what we call the MRBA, and we work together on all the coastal things that we get done. So this is not an impossible thing to do, but it has to be done. I've been trying to do it since 15, and it's just driving me crazy.
Thanks.
That's something we can look at. It certainly is, the building serves its purpose. It certainly is a limited use building, but we can certainly
Well, it's
try to
not limited
streamline
when
that.
you don't have toilets in a bunch of houses and you need to
Or
get
you can't
people-
get off the island because of
Yeah,
whiteout
there's no
conditions. Yes,
question.
you're right,
It's
Ron.
not- It's
Yeah.
not, it's the only thing we have.
Right. Thank you, Ron.
Right back.
I'm Peggy Poppy. I live on Plum Island. I have a request, which is I don't know how we might be able to get a couple AED devices on the island, but I think it's something that's really needed. It takes sometimes, I know when there's a big storm, you have somebody out there, but in the process of waiting for people to get there, just any time of year, sometimes it takes, more than 20 minutes to get somebody down to the far end of the island. We had a death on our street this year, and we should have access to a couple AED devices on the island. So I don't know how that could happen, but I'd like some help in having that happen. The other thing is, I think, speak to you when we had the sewer problem when we were in 2015. I did a lot of research. My background's in public health. I had made some recommendations. I did research found the availability of some appropriate things that people can have on hand to safely use as an alternative when the sewage system goes out. At the time I was told they didn't want people using anything. What was happening was people were creating their own situations with buckets and kitty litter and bags, and they were creating their own systems when there are actually some safe systems out there that people can purchase very inexpensively. And I think that that's something, when you're talking about getting people prepared, that we should give people information about how they can purchase these things. I mean, they're like space, they use them in, you know, NASA, you know, uses them. There's a gel pack, and it's just common sense that you don't have people dumping stuff in kitty litter, and I got nowhere, and I was very frustrated, and it really was disturbing to me that people were dumping stuff, and you were saying, well, they shouldn't be, and we should be using these toilets in the middle of the night when it was, you know, freezing cold out. You have 2 toilets on the island, and people are not going to be going to these 2 toilets if they're staying in their house. Porta potties, so. Right. Well, anyway, there are very simple systems. They're inexpensive. You can get a pack of them. You can keep them in your basement, and we should make that information available to people so when they're doing their prep, you know, they can, you know, can buy them online, and that's another thing. And then the other concern I have is about phone systems. I don't think people realize when we had this death on our street this summer, I don't think people always realize when you use your cell phone, if there is cell service in a storm or whatever, that it doesn't go directly to our 911 system. And so this person was using their cell phone, they were calling, they got sent to 5 different centers, and it took over half an hour to get an ambulance out there. So that's something else that people should be informed about, and it's really helpful if people have landlines or know somebody who has a landline, because if the cell service is out, people need to have access to a landline in order to get the kind of help they need without getting sent all over creation.
Thank you.
That's a good point. Might want to put down the actual local phone number to your police department or fire department in the cell phone. 'Cause sometimes, especially on the island, landlines might go out, but you might still have cell service. So it's good to have both numbers. Yeah. Those are some of the limitations. You know, and you know, if you look at places like Puerto Rico, I mean, some of those cell towers got knocked out, so that's also not always a fallback. Another thing, you know, to think about putting in your arsenal of tools, they make these small battery packs now of lithium-ion batteries, and I use them actually to jumpstart cars. They're only about this big, but they're very useful, and they have USB ports, and you can charge your phone off of that. I mean, it'll probably supply a few phones for a whole number of days in the event of a power outage. And they're a couple $100, but they're worth having in the event that you lose power. And certainly, I mean, you don't have to go for the $10,000 generator to, you know, light all the Christmas lights on your house. You just need one that keeps the furnace going, keeps the pipes from freezing, and allows you to maybe, you know, boil water, cook a little bit, and you know, you decide what it is you're going to use. You know, you turn off the heat when you're going to watch TV or whatever. But it'll get you through, and that's the kind of thing you need to look at. Do we have any more questions? Well, here we go.
So I have a question about infrastructure. And it was interesting to hear interesting to hear about the sewer plant and the dam at the Artichoke River. Everything you talked about was multi-year projects, big money, raise the dam, move the sewer plant. What if this winter we knew what was happening in the Mother Day storm was coming? What is Plan B? Or is it step back and move out?
To answer that in more of a positive down to the more negative order, the low-hanging fruit would be raising the dam. As far as this winter, no, but, you know, if the salinity and the contamination did breach the dam, there would be a time frame where we would have to use our alternate water supplies. But as far as raising the dam, that's not that's not as much of a long-term as some of the improvements that would be to the treatment plant. I say that because I'm an optimist, and I always, I'm always assuming that it's going to be easier and quicker because I'm so energetic with getting it done. But raising that dam, if we can get the money, it shouldn't be a 5-year plan. I would like to push it much sooner. To answer your question, if it did go over, there would just be a number of days that we would have to let the waters recede, let the water flush it out, and we would do a boil water order. We would use alternate water supplies like well number 2. We have means. The treatment plant's a little bit different. If we had a massive hurricane for the treatment plant, that would be your typical situation of analyze and figure out what kind of damage has happened. The worst thing that happens with treatment facilities is you get the contamination downstream, and it lingers, and it gets, you know, it'll reach the coast, the beaches, and then people will end up getting sick. But as far as the treatment plant itself, if the key with that long-term is building up some kind of elevation increase to keep it out. In the short term, you would just have to figure out what the damage was.
Are there options like sandbagging it
Yeah.
off and things like
Yeah,
that to buy you time?
the short terms that are going through our head are, you know, providing the sandbags, the pallets of sandbags. They also have devices that are, you know, barriers that you can put in place, and you lock them in. There's those type of things. There's a transformer that's ground mount right now at elevation 12. That needs to go up. I call that cheap. You get a crane, lift it up, pour new concrete, at least we'll have electricity. Any entrance points to the buildings, that we have to get a little bit more creative, you know, get the barriers. But that's doable, and that can buy 10 years until it really starts until the nuisance changes to a catastrophe. And right now, all those things are relatively doable, relatively cheap, that can buy us the time, hopefully, for like 20 years. The other stuff is 40 plus as far as relocating, but I wanted people to start thinking that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions? No more curious minds. We've answered all the questions. One comment I have is, Newburyport's, I think, somewhat forward-thinking. I mean, certainly we've got vulnerabilities, but there are many communities out there that don't even realize what their vulnerabilities are. And obviously, everybody's behind the 8 ball as far as being ready for something, but the first step is realizing that you have exposure and then working towards minimizing those risks and coming up with some long-term plans that got to relocate infrastructure to better areas and figure out different ways of doing things. I can tell you that in 10 days we're not going to have a storm like this, but Jack brings up a valid point. I mean, March or April, I mean, the storm season for extratropical systems runs basically from September through May here in New England. Any one of those months are months where we could get a surprise storm. They don't have to be a hurricane. It just needs to be a really strong system, and that already develops. So any other questions? David, could you step up to the mic?
Just a comment. I think the gentleman's absolutely right. What if it happens in December? And I think there's a lot of us thinking we should be doing something now. I think the good thing is that the city now has a good assessment of the vulnerabilities. It's done it several different ways. We're going to do it one more way, and hopefully that one more way will come with some real prioritization, which says this is something that you could do right now, and this is something you could start with. Will it be the right thing? You don't know. But if you do none of them, you know you won't get it. So I think we're actually at a critical point that the vulnerabilities have been assessed, and we're actually at the point in time of picking up those low-hanging fruits, the ones that don't cost the fortune, like raising the turnpike to Plum Island. That's got to be done at some point in time, but it could be that protecting the wastewater treatment plant is the low-hanging fruit that you were talking about, or protecting our water supply is that low-hanging fruit. Let's identify those as priorities, and let's start picking them off. So there's a little bit of optimism there that we should see some progress. Thank you.
I think it's also very encouraging that, like becoming a green community, that the MVP once we finish that grant and identify those action steps, that the next step then is that we're eligible for additional rounds of funding to be able to finance some of these action steps. And we've never been in a situation where that type of grant programs have been available to us. We've been sort of piecing together all of our learning over the last several years, and I think, as you can hear, we've worked hard to develop a much deeper understanding of what's happening in terms of sea level rise, storm surge, and being part of this. I encourage everyone to read this grant that just came out in final form yesterday, I think. We will make sure that we have a link on our website to that for you to read. And from here, I'm very encouraged about the work that we'll be doing going forward to hopefully be able to address things, like David said, the low-hanging fruit within this next coming year. So I certainly appreciate all of you being here tonight to listen to sort of what we've been doing as a city in terms of moving our efforts forward in terms of addressing sea level rise and storm surge. And I hope we have an opportunity to do another one of these, and once we've finished the MVP grant and we have additional information to share with you.
So if there aren't any more questions, I have just one more slide to leave you with so that you can ponder things. Before I move on, any other questions?
I think I do have one. I'm wondering if on the website as well, because I know I'm not going to read 230 pages, but I wonder if there could be something like a list of the things we've talked about tonight, like who people would contact. I mean, I never knew that the fire department was the person to call in this kind of emergency. And also something as simple as a list of things you should have: non-perishable food, water, batteries, things like that. Maybe if that was on the website and then in the paper, it would be good for us, because it's not something we all think about. And I know we're all supposed to have that grab-and-go kit.
Right. Well, a lot of this,
and a lot of us don't.
it's a very good question.
One of them.
All of that information is available on MEMA's website. We're in the process now of, all of the city's websites are being improved, and the emergency management website is almost done. And all that information will be on there, and even links to go to all of MEMA's information.
But maybe if the city...
Yeah, we'll put it all up.
It's in our health department's website, but there's so much information there, it's hard to pull it out, and we need to make it a much more accessible link from the home page. So I think your point is very well taken, Jeanette. Thank you.
But just to leave you with a thought along those lines in terms of personal preparedness, if you go to if you get on the web and you Google, 4 elements of survival, and we're talking about people that are stranded on a desert island or out in the woods, there's really 4 things you need to live. You need shelter, you need fire, you need water and food. So if you look at your house and your vulnerabilities in light of those areas and organize your backup plan around those areas, you might not be comfortable, but you'll make it through. And, think about fire in terms of just energy in general. It could be a generator. It could be a gas grill that you cook outside with. I mean, at least you have the ability to boil water, cook food, and do that sort of thing. If you have a generator, at least your house will stay warm, it won't freeze, and therefore you have shelter. So all of these things sort of interrelate. So, go back and look at your houses in that respect and kind of organize your own personal plan around those 4 areas, and you should do okay. So I just wanted to conclude with a question about how likely is a storm like this. And so I mentioned in the past, I looked at 3 historical storms that were equally bad, and it happened in my short lifetime. And the question is, so we really haven't had a storm like this, right? I mean, the Barrier Island washover and all that sort of thing. So, I say you got to look back into history for that question. And there's actually telltale signs. So you remember this picture of the overwash from Hurricane Sandy down in the New Jersey, Long Island area. You can find these kinds of patterns in our barrier beaches. And if you actually go to Salisbury Beach, you see this massive overwash that happened probably well over 100 years ago, when sea level was a lot lower. There wasn't as much heat in the atmosphere, and the storms weren't as big as they are getting to be now. This happened, and when I say this happened 100 years ago, it's because if you look closely, in those areas around the overwash, that's where they actually built houses and streets, because that's where the land was more solid. Anything beyond that was marsh. So sometime 100 years ago or more, this area was washed over. And it probably happened on Plum Island too, but because of the natural dune system reestablishing itself, these overwash fans are kind of covered and hidden on Plum Island. So my point is this: if it hasn't happened in a really long time, and now we have a deeper ocean and an ocean that contains more heat, and we've got changes happening in the atmosphere that support bigger storms and storms backing in off the ocean, in some respects, time is sort of not on our side. The sense of urgency, I think, should be there to start, thinking in earnest that something like this could happen. Hopefully it doesn't, and maybe it won't, but statistically speaking, the longer time goes without one of these storms, the greater the likelihood that one will eventually happen. So that was my final point for the evening. I want to thank you all for turning out tonight. We went about half an hour over from where we planned, and I appreciate your patience for hanging out. And please turn in any of your comment and feedback forms. We'd like to see how we should improve our programs. Thanks again.